Stand at the edge of a German village in the spring of 1943 and look at what you see. A church with a stone tower. A square with a well and a war memorial from the last war, the one that was supposed to have ended. All wars with names carved into it that are the same surnames as the names on the letterboxes of the houses surrounding the square. A bakery, a butcher, a schoolhouse, a guest house with painted shutters. Fields beyond the last houses, and beyond the fields, the tree line. And above the tree line, a sky that is the same sky it has always been over this valley. From the edge of the village, looking in, you might conclude that the war is elsewhere. That this place, small, ordered, rooted in a landscape it has occupied for 300 years, exists in some separate category from the thing that is consuming the continent around it. You would be wrong. The war is not elsewhere. The war is in every house on that square, in every conversation at the bakery counter, in every letter that arrives, and every letter that does not. The village looks the way it has always looked. It does not feel the way it has always felt. And the difference between those two things, between what the village shows the world and what the village contains, is the story of what daily life in a German village in 1943 actually was. By 1943, the war had been inside the villages of Germany for long enough that the absence it had created had become the central fact of daily life. The men were gone. Not all of them, the very old and the very young, remained. And the men whose injuries had returned them from the front, and the men whose occupations had been deemed essential to the war economy, and who had been held back from conscription on that basis. But the men who had been between 18 and 40 in 1939 were, in the vast majority of cases, somewhere else. They were in Russia, they were in North Africa, they were in occupied France, or the Netherlands, or Norway. They were in the ground. The village of 1943 was a village whose male population had been extracted by the war and replaced by the people the war left behind, the women who were running the farms and the workshops and the households that the men had previously run, the children who were growing up in a world where the absence of fathers was the normal condition rather than the exception, the old men who had fought in the last war and who understood, in a way they did not always say aloud, what the letters from the Eastern Front meant when they described the conditions the men were living in. In this video, we will go inside the daily life of a German village in 1943. Not the Germany of the newsreels and the rallies and the official propaganda that told the German people that the war was going well and that sacrifice was noble and that the fatherland would prevail, but the Germany of the village square and the kitchen and the school and the church and the fields, where ordinary people were living through a war that was entering its most difficult phase, and where the gap between what the regime said and what daily experience showed was becoming, for many people, impossible to ignore. The mourning in a German village in 1943 began, as mournings in German villages had always begun, with the animals. The farms that surrounded the village required attention at a time that the animals dictated and that the war had not changed. And the women who were now running those farms, the Bäuerinnen, the farmers' wives, who had, in many cases, been working alongside their husbands for years and who had taken on the full responsibility of the farm when conscription took the husbands away, were in the barns before the light came. The cows needed milking. The pigs needed feeding. The horses, in the farms that still had horses, needed attention, though the Wehrmacht's demand for horses had been significant enough that many farms had lost their working animals to military requisition and had replaced them with labor that was human, slower, and considerably more expensive in terms of the calories it required to function. The farm in 1943 ran on women and children, and the occasional prisoner of war, French or Polish or Soviet men assigned to agricultural labor in the German countryside under conditions that ranged from tolerable to brutal, depending on the nationality of the prisoner and the character of the farmer supervising them. The prisoner of war, working on the farms of rural Germany in 1943, was a presence in the daily life of the village that the official Germany of the regime found ideologically uncomfortable and practically unavoidable. The labor shortage created by conscription could not be filled without foreign workers, And the farms of Germany were by 1943 dependent on that foreign labor to a degree that the farmers, if they thought carefully about it, understood was a vulnerability rather than a solution. French prisoners of war, who were Christian and European, and whose presence the regime found easier to accommodate within its racial hierarchy, were treated on most farms with a rough equivalence to German farm laborers housed adequately, fed sufficiently, allowed a degree of movement that reflected their status as workers rather than enemies. Soviet prisoners, who occupied a different position in the regime's racial ideology, were treated with a harshness that reflected that ideology, and their mortality rate in the agricultural labor system, as in every other German institution in which they were held, was a measure of that harshness. The German farm wife who managed the labor of these men on a daily basis was managing a moral situation that the regime had created and that no official guidance adequately addressed. Some treated the men in their charge with a basic human decency that the regime would not have endorsed. Some did not. The school in a German village in 1943 was an institution that the war had transformed in ways that the children attending it were too young to have a before and after comparison for, but that the teachers, mostly women by this point in the war, the male teachers having been largely conscripted, understood as a profound change from what education had been. The curriculum had been adjusted since 1,933 inches, ways that the National Socialist government's educational ideology required, and by 1943, that adjustment was a decade old and entirely normalized. The children in the school had never known a curriculum that was not shaped by it. History was the history of German greatness and German victimhood at the hands of the Versailles powers. Biology included the racial science that the regime had placed at the center of its worldview. The maps on the classroom walls showed the Greater German Reich in its current extent, which in 1943 was the largest it had been or would be. The children learned what they were taught. They also learned, from the world outside the school, things that the curriculum did not cover and could not contain the names on the lists of the fallen that were read in the village church, the faces of the men who came back from the front on leave, and who were not the faces they had been before they left, the conversations that stopped when children entered the room. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls occupied a significant portion of the time of German children in 1943 that would, in peacetime, have been unstructured. The organizations had been built through the 1930s into institutions that were simultaneously political, social, and paramilitary. And by 1943, they were deeply embedded in the texture of village life. The meetings were regular, the activities were organized, the peer pressure to participate was considerable, and the organizations provided something that was genuinely valued by many of the children in them: a structure, a sense of belonging, and the particular kind of purpose that comes from being told with conviction that you are important and that what you do matters. The ideology embedded in that structure was the ideology of the regime, and it was transmitted to the children inside the structure with the same completeness with which any ideology is transmitted to young people by the institutions that surround them. The children of the German village in 1943 were not, in the main, skeptics. They were children. They believed what the world they had grown up in had taught them to believe. The rationing system that governed food supply in Germany in 1943 was more generous in its allocations than the British rationing system. Germany's control of the agricultural resources of occupied Europe had allowed the regime to maintain civilian food supply at a level that the British, dependent on convoy routes under submarine attack, could not match. But by 1943, the allocations were tightening. The occupation of North Africa was ending badly. The Eastern Front's demands on the German war economy were intensifying. The calories available to the German civilian in 1943 were fewer than they had been in 1940, and the quality of the food within those calories was declining as the war's demands on German agriculture increased and the availability of the imported goods that had supplemented domestic production shrank. The housewife managing the family's ration cards in a German village in 1943 was managing a situation that was adequate. No one in the village was hungry in the acute sense, but that was less adequate than it had been, and that was moving in a direction that, the direction of the war made it reasonable to expect would continue to worsen. The Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, the inexpensive radio that the regime had subsidized and distributed to German households through the 1930s in order to ensure that the political messaging of the government reached every home, sat in the kitchen of most houses in the German village of 1,943. The news broadcasts spoke of strategic retreats and defensive regroupings and heroic resistance. They spoke of enemy losses that always exceeded German losses by ratios that the mathematics of the war made implausible to anyone who was paying close attention. They spoke of the fatherland's ultimate victory with a consistency that began by 1943, to have the quality of an assertion that was being made loudly, precisely because the evidence for it was becoming harder to see. The village that listened to those broadcasts did not, in the main, disbelieve them outright. It received them with a particular combination of partial acceptance and private skepticism that is the characteristic response of a population that has been living inside official messaging long enough to have developed an intuition about the gap between what the messaging says and what the available evidence suggests. That gap became harder to ignore in 1943 than it had been in the previous years of the war, for reasons that were specific and visible in the daily life of the village. The casualty notices, the Gefallenen Anzeigen, were appearing in the regional newspaper with a frequency that the village could not fail to notice, because the names in the notices were the names on the village's letterboxes. The war memorial from the last war, with its names from 1914 to 1918, was accumulating a companion list. A family in the village whose son had been at Stalingrad had received a notification in February, a notification that used language which the regime had developed for the purpose of conveying death without saying death, speaking of a hero's sacrifice and the fatherland's gratitude in formulations that the mother reading it in her kitchen understood perfectly, because the formulations were by 1943 well enough known in every German village that the official language of death had become a dialect that everyone spoke and no one needed translated. The family had not been told where the son died, or how, or what had happened to his body. They had been told that he had fallen for Germany. The village attended the memorial service in the church. The village said what was said on such occasions. The village went home and did not say what it thought. The church occupied a position in the life of the German village in 1943 that the regime had attempted through the 1930s to diminish without fully succeeding. The Catholic villages of Bavaria and the Rhineland and the Protestant villages of Prussia and Saxony had responded to the regime's pressure on the churches with a resistance that was rarely political and often decisive. The crosses that Gauleiter had ordered removed from schoolrooms had been put back by parents who made clear with a firmness that the regime found inconvenient in the middle of a war that needed civilian compliance, that the crosses were staying. The village pastor or priest was, in most cases, one of the few people in the village who occupied a position of moral authority that was independent of the regime, and the sermons preached in the village churches of Germany in 1943 were not uniformly the sermons of men who had made their peace with what the regime was doing. Some were not. The ones that were not were preached with the particular careful language of men who understood that what they were saying could be reported and what they were not saying was the thing that mattered. And the congregations who heard those sermons understood the thing that was not being said and received it in the enforced silence of the church as a form of permission to think what they were already thinking. The letters from the front were the most direct connection between the village and the war, and they were also the most carefully managed. The military censorship that monitored correspondence from the front was known to the men writing and the families receiving, and it shaped the letters in ways that removed from them the specific information that would have been most useful and left in them the emotional content that censorship had no mechanism for excising. A soldier on the Eastern Front in 1943 could not tell his family where he was or what the tactical situation was or how many men in his unit had been killed in the last month. He could tell them that he was thinking of them. He could tell them that he missed the smell of the kitchen in the evening. He could tell them that he hoped the harvest had gone well and that the pig was fattening up properly and that his youngest brother was helping his mother adequately. He could write these things, And he did write them, because writing them was the only available way of reaching across the distance the war had placed between him and the world he was from. And the family reading the letters at the kitchen table understood from the things the letters could not say, as much as from the things they said, what the Eastern Front in 1943 was. The women who were running the German village in 1943, running it in the literal sense of doing the work that kept its economy and its social fabric functional, were doing so inside a framework of official recognition that was deeply inadequate to the reality of what they were carrying. The regime's ideology, with its insistence on the primacy of the German woman's domestic and reproductive role, had not been designed to accommodate the German woman who was simultaneously managing a farm, raising 3 children, processing the rationing allocation, maintaining the social obligations of village life, waiting for letters, and living with the specific kind of fear that is produced by loving someone who is in a place where people die. The official messaging told her that her sacrifice was noble and that the fatherland was grateful. The official messaging did not tell her what to do when the letter stopped coming. It did not tell her how to answer her children's questions. It did not tell her how to continue running the farm in the 4th year of a war that had been described when it began as a matter of weeks. The Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, the concept of racial and national solidarity that stood at the center of National Socialist ideology, expressed itself in the German village of 1943, partly as genuine solidarity, and partly as the particular kind of social pressure that small communities exert on their members in times of collective stress. The genuine solidarity was real. Neighbors helped neighbors with farm work, with childcare, with the practical problems that the absence of men created and that no single household could solve alone. The social pressure was also real. Expressions of doubt about the war's conduct or outcome, criticism of the regime's management of the situation, sympathy for the people the regime had designated as enemies. All of these were dangerous in the specific way that things are dangerous. In small communities where everyone knows everyone and the local party representative lived 3 doors down from the church, and the children reported at their Hitler Youth meetings what they had heard at home. The bombing had not yet reached the German village in 1,943 inches, the way it would reach it by 1944 and 1945. But it had reached the cities nearby, and the village knew about it. The refugees who arrived from bombed cities from Hamburg after the firestorm of July 1943, from the Ruhr cities that the RAF had been targeting, systematically brought with them the physical evidence of what strategic bombing produced. And the village that received them was receiving, in the bodies and the faces and the possessions of those people, information about the war that the Volksempfänger was not providing. The bombed-out family billeted in the village schoolhouse had been in Hamburg on the night of the 27th of July. What they described, when they described it at all, and the state they were in when they arrived, told the village something about the war that was happening to Germany that no news broadcast had conveyed with equivalent clarity. What daily life in a German village in 1943 felt like from inside it, the subjective texture of it, the emotional reality of it, was something that existed in the space between the official version and the private one. Officially, life was proceeding as normal. The farms were producing, the school was open, the church was holding services. The Gasthaus was serving beer on Saturday evenings to the men who remained to drink it. The festivals of the agricultural year were observed. The village looked to anyone passing through it and seeing its surface like a village that was managing. What it felt like from inside the houses and the kitchens and the churches and the barns was something that the surface did not reveal, a sustained, low-frequency fear that had been present so long it had become indistinguishable from the baseline of experience. A grief that was sometimes acute and sometimes compressed into the practical demands of the day, and a relationship with the future that had changed in character from what it had been before the war, in a way that was difficult to articulate, but that anyone living inside it understood without articulation. The future had become a thing that was waited for rather than planned for. Not because planning was impossible, but because the variables that the war had introduced into every plan made planning feel like an activity that was happening in a language the war did not speak. The village endured. That is the simplest and the most accurate thing that can be said about the German village in 1943. It endured in the way that communities endure, when the forces acting on them are too large to resist and too present to ignore, by continuing the activities that defined it as a community, by maintaining the structures that gave daily life its shape, by doing the work the seasons required, and attending the services the church offered, and writing the letters that crossed the distance to the front, and reading the letters that came back. It endured with the specific combination of genuine belief, willed ignorance, private doubt, and practical necessity that is the characteristic survival mechanism of ordinary people inside extraordinary systems. The church tower was still standing. The names on the war memorial from the last war had been joined by new names from this one. The fields beyond the last houses were the same fields they had always been. The sky above the tree line was the same sky. If this documentary gave you a deeper and more human understanding of what ordinary German civilians lived through in their villages in 1943, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who would find it meaningful, and write in the comments what moved you most. Until the next video.